Hello learners, let us discuss today A Defense of Indian Culture by Sri Aurobindo. The lesson we are going to do is not only Sri Aurobindo's reply to an ill-informed critical evaluation of India by English critic, it is also an exploration of Indian civilization and a strong defense of it. We'll first look at the biographical information about the author, the type of work and the years of publication. Sri Aurobindo was born in Calcutta, India on 15th August 1872. Education in England gave him a wide introduction to the culture of ancient, medieval and modern Europe. He was a brilliant scholar in Greek and Latin. He had learned French from his childhood and studied for himself German and Italian sufficiently to study literature written in those languages. It was first through English literature and subsequently through the literature of other European languages that Sri Aurobindo had his first acquaintance with the world of letters. His finer perception of Western achievements had not only sensitized his mind to an inward perception of the Indian past to which he belonged in spirit. Immediately after he had returned home, he plunged into a study of Bengali, his mother tongue, and Sanskrit, the classical language of India. Knowing that he can identify himself in spirit with his cultural past only when he can master its literary achievements. During his early career in India as a professor of English and French and later as vice principal of a college, he devoured most of the Indian classics which gave shape to his later inquiry of Indian civilization. Sri Aurobindo, who was a great patriot and freedom fighter in his earlier years, spent the later years of his life in spiritual quest. He left his mortal frame on December 5th, 1950, leaving his philosophy behind. The Life Divine, Essays on the Gita, Synthesis of Yoga, and Savitri, his epic poem, are among his noted works. During his stay in Pondicherry, Sri Aurobindo evolved a new method of spiritual practice, which he called integral yoga. Sri Aurobindo Ashram attracts people from all corners of the world even today. In the issue of the Arya, in which Sri Aurobindo concluded, "Is India civilized?" he began another series dealing in more detail with William Archer's criticisms of Indian culture, taken to represent a typical Western attitude at that time. The comprehensive A Defense of Indian Culture, with sections on religion and spirituality, Indian art, Indian literature, and Indian polity, had originally appeared in the Arya from December 1919 to January 1921. When its publication was first proposed to him in 1949, Sri Aurobindo said that he had intended to alter much of it and to omit all but brief references to William Archer's criticisms. The desired alterations were never made. Nevertheless, these essays give us a view of India's living past and throbbing contemporary reality that is refreshingly original as well as enlightening. William Archer was on the whole a sound dramatic critic, although some of his criticism on the lesser Elizabethans was too harsh and needed a T.S. Eliot to put the record straight. However, when Archer ventured with more valor than discretion to indict the culture of a subcontinent like India, he was really asking for trouble. The provocation he gave was outrageous enough, for otherwise a Sthitaprajna, a yogi like Sri Aurobindo, would not have found it necessary to take notice of it. Archer was not merely Archer, but he was a type, a phenomenon, the type of the West's supercilious castigation of India, the phenomenon of incomprehension playing a critic. Sri Aurobindo's series of essays come as a lightning series of arrows to hit unerringly the offending target. Honest criticism is certainly not unwelcome, but it can have no value when it is mere slander and vitriol throwing. Archer's constant departures into irrational extravagance, his deliberate unfairness, and his absolute ignorance of the things on which he was passing his confident damnatory judgments make his supposed criticism a journalistic fake, not an honest critical production. Many Westerners see Indian culture from a purely Western perspective and fail to understand it in its depth and range. If there have been denigrators of Indian culture like Abbé Du Bois, Macaulay, and William Archer, there have also been staunch supporters and admirers like Sir William Jones, Max Muller, and Sir John Woodroffe. Negative and positive responses seem to cancel out one another. But this does not absolve Indians from the duty to study their heritage, to cherish, and to make proper use of it to meet contemporary demands. It was this consideration that made Sri Aurobindo write at length, first with a view to dispelling clouds of misunderstanding, and then turning the light of right understanding on India's unique cultural heritage. Before getting into a critical study of the Indian past as related to its religion and spirituality, arts, literature, and polity, Sri Aurobindo comments on William Archer, shows how unqualified he was to judge an alien culture, and then moves on to evaluate the real worth of Indian culture. Sri Aurobindo turns to look at the values of Indian civilization with an impartial eye of the true literary critic. He isn't partial to any particular way of thinking. In the Arnoldian sense, it is a seeing of things as they are. Indian civilization has been unique in its religio-philosophical stand. It is not just a cultural system, but an immense religious effort of the human spirit. It is much more than a creed, a cult, a dogma. It is a continuously enlarging tradition of the Godward endeavor of the human spirit. European critics, even when they are sympathetic to the Indian past, make an attempt to look at the appreciatory aspects of it, but they are unable to grasp the finer nuances of a different culture because of the difference in their very outlook of religion. To the Indian mind, the least important part of religion is its dogma. The religious spirit matters, not the theological credo. On the contrary, to the Western mind, a fixed intellectual belief is the most important part of a cult. It is its core of meaning. It is the very thing that distinguishes it from others. The mind, accustomed to the European idea, is disturbed by comparisons and feels a baffling difference to whose secret it is a stranger. Preconceived notions and expectations stand in the way of full receptivity and intimate understanding. Sri Aurobindo has a unique ability to look at Indian culture with a well-informed understanding and actual experience of it, combined with the critical eye of the Western intellect without being limited by its cultural bounds. Sri Aurobindo does not simply reveal the essence of Indian religion and spirituality. He sets this in the context of its religious and spiritual traditions, examines its development through the ages, and contrasts it with European religion. We are shown how spiritual essence was already present in the Vedas, the world's oldest scriptures, though most of these sacred teachings were couched in a veiled symbolic language, accessible only to the initiated. Subsequently, the Upanishads revealed the same essential teachings to the masses in a philosophical language, and still later, the various multifaceted spiritual approaches to the infinite were developed in epics such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, with the core spiritual teaching placed in the Mahabharata's episode of the Bhagavad Gita, as well as through many other religious movements and spiritual teachings. Sri Aurobindo isolates certain essential strands in the bewilderingly complex web of ancient Indian religious thought and practice. First, there is a belief in an omnipresent reality. Second, it is the individual's acceptance of the need for inner development and outer discipline. Third, the practice of one of the prescribed religious or spiritual disciplines with a view to attaining divine grace or knowledge. And fourth, conformity to the laws of individual and collective life. Indian spirituality asserts that all life and thought are in the end a means of progress towards self-realization and God-realization. True happiness in this world is the aim of man. It lies in the finding and maintenance of a natural harmony of spirit, mind, and body. A culture is to be valued to the extent to which it has discovered the right key of this harmony and organized its expressive motives and movements. A civilization must be judged by the manner in which all its principles, ideas, forms, ways of living work to bring that harmony out, manage its rhythmic play, and secure its continuance or the development of its motives. A civilization in pursuit of this aim may be predominantly material, like modern European culture. It may be predominantly mental and intellectual, like the old Greco-Roman, or predominantly spiritual, like the still persistent culture of India. There have been triumphs and failures too, and a critical review of both must help us to draw the right lessons so that we may be in a position from a sure ground of self-knowledge to take a leap into the future with self-assurance. We now move on into the segment that discusses Indian art and literature. Sri Aurobindo examines the nature and qualities of Indian art, concentrating on its architecture, sculpture, and painting. His focus is on revealing the essence of Indian art, its foundation in spirituality, its rich complexity, its depiction and expression of the divine, the inner worlds and the soul of mankind. He points out that Indian architecture, painting, sculpture are not only intimately one in inspiration with the central things in Indian philosophy, religion, yoga, culture, but a specially intense expression of their significance. They have been very largely an aesthetic script of India's spiritual, contemplative and religious experience. Sri Aurobindo reveals an extraordinary knowledge and appreciation of Indian art. At the same time, he is sensitive to cultural differences in understanding and appreciation, and is carefully instructive in considering the differences in European and Indian art and in the aesthetic sensibilities that are likely to arise from these differences. As a result, this section of his book gives the Western reader the essential keys to enter into a deeper appreciation of Indian art, while giving the Indian, who may be influenced more or less strongly by Western cultural pressures, a better understanding and firmer confidence in India's artistic traditions. The chapters on Indian architecture, sculpture and painting are the quintessence of art criticism, and the Indian student as well as the unbiased Westerner will find in these pages insights and explorations of immeasurable value. In the chapters on Indian literature, we are shown again the fundamental spiritual basis of Indian culture. As the greatest and earliest formative works of Indian literature are spiritual and religious. We are given an introduction to the Vedas, the Upanishads, the great epics of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, the later classical age of ancient literature, including the poetry of Kalidasa, various philosophical writings of the Middle Ages, the religious poetry of the Puranas, the yogic and spiritual texts of the Tantras, Vaishnava poetry and others. We are given a taste of the spiritual substance of this sacred literature and some appreciation of the tremendous influence it had upon the development of Indian spirituality and culture. Aurobindo also examines the Indian polity, the development of India's administrative and governing structures, set in their historical context. Here, as in other aspects of Indian culture, we find a fundamental basis in spirituality and a sophisticated, intuitive, and humane development. We are shown in considerable detail and with an obvious mastery of facts, the arrangement and workings of the governing structures from ancient times to the present. A central tenet of the system was its focus on the upholding of dharma, the duty and right rule of action for individuals of varying positions in the society, including the king. The governing structures developed organically from the extended family to the clan and villages, to associations among smaller grouping, to larger grouping within kingdoms. Power and legislative authority was distributed throughout the system and included civic and general bodies that represented a cross section of the peoples. The monarch was in effect a constitutional monarch who could be removed due to mismanagement or abuse of power through the assemblies. We are shown how the system eventually broke down under foreign invasion and influence. We are led to the admission that in an important sense the political system failed in that it was unable to achieve a unity of the whole Indian subcontinent, a difficult endeavor in any case. Nor could it sufficiently protect its peoples from foreign military invasion and subjugation. Interestingly, this failure is in part due to the superimposed artificial administrative structure, which was inconsistent with the inner and spiritual basis of Indian culture and polity. He argues that this inner basis of India's unity reflected most directly in her spirituality and religion, and also in other fields of culture, has remained intact through the millennia despite frequent and enduring foreign occupations of India. Before we conclude, let us discuss the fact that Sri Aurobindo looks at Indian culture with the critical consistency of a mind that is mature with the clarity of Western thought and which also lived the essential breadth of the glorious past of India. It is therefore a refreshing study of some of the finest cultural aspects of mankind. There are passages of comparative criticism that only a global comprehension and an infallible eye for right discrimination could have made possible. A defense of Indian culture is a facet by facet study of Indian culture, historical as well as interpretative, illuminated by revealing beams of comparative criticism in an 18-chapter sequence. It is much more than a defense. Rather, it is a restatement, a robust stock-taking, and a manifesto for the future. 4 self-sufficient sections on religion and spirituality, Indian art, Indian literature, and Indian polity are united by the underground waters of the spirit, the one power, the one inspiration, is seen to achieve varied self-expression, a satisfying play of multiplicity originating from a single fount of all-sustaining energy. There is an underlying rhythm in the seeming reiterations, and this too is part of the fascination of the work and augments its expository charm and power of persuasion. It is necessary to acknowledge the contrast between the Western science-based materialist civilization and India's still persistent spiritual culture before venturing to discuss their individual merits. Unfortunately, in a discussion of this kind, which should be conducted on an informed intellectual level, politics often romps in to confuse the issues. That the British, a Western power, happened to rule India at that time did not by itself prove that Western civilization was superior to India's. But even many Indians felt hypnotized by the West's political ascendancy and castigated unreservedly India's decadent civilization. On the other hand, the reform movements of the 19th century and the spiritual phenomenon of Sri Ramakrishna and his disciple Vivekananda's sensational appearance at Chicago gave the needed break, opened the world's eyes to the persisting vitality of India's spiritual culture. And there was no reason to be apologetic or defeatist as before. Sri Aurobindo responded to criticism of Indian culture when the time had come to ask the right questions about culture and to formulate answers in a spirit of aggressive defense. This question of Indian civilization, once it has raised this greater issue, shifts from its narrow meaning and opens the doors to a much larger problem about whether the future of humanity lies in a culture founded solely upon reason and science. The question that needs to be answered is whether the truth of our being lies in seeking to know itself, to enlarge its consciousness, to progress in the spirit, and grow into the full light of self-knowledge and inner perfection of the divine. Whatever had been the attitudes of the past on the East-West question, in the 20th century, the world is awakening both to the insufficiency of reason, science, and technology, and to the possibilities promised by the integral Indian view that made spirituality the basis of whole existence. There is certainly a need to take a larger perspective. I hope this lesson has set you thinking. All the best to each one of you in your endeavor to explore the depth and beauty of the culture and civilization of this noble land. Thank you.